Okay, so the question that I had was about diagnostic tests in prep books. So Barron's, Kaplan, Princeton Review, all those books often include diagnostic tests. The question is more or less, are they useful? If they are simulated SATs, like if the Princeton Review's diagnostic test or Barron's diagnostic test, whatever, is just a simulated SAT, like they just created their own SAT or ACT, it's not useful. If the diagnostic test is targeted in a specific way to certain skills, so for example, if it's just a regular math test that will help you figure out what math concepts, formulas, ideas you don't understand, or if it's a writing test or English test that tells you what grammar rules you don't know or whatever, that's useful. But if it's just a simulated SAT or ACT, it's actually worse than useful. Worse than useless, because generally you don't want to use third-party tests as indications of much of anything. They're good for extra practice, but that's about it. So diagnostic tests to review, not very useful. If they're just simulated tests, not useful at all. If they are targeted to certain skills or abilities, which that's pretty rare, they are useful. So for example, I do have a grammar diagnostic test on my site available for free that you can use for the SAT and even for the ACT English. But the SAT grammar diagnostic on my site, reasonprep.com, that targets a specific skill, concept, basically grammar rules. So this is something that I've covered elsewhere. Actually, I have a video coming out on this a little bit on math. Actually, it's coming out Tuesday. Very short little video, highlight from a previous stream related to SAT and ACT math, avoiding silly mistakes. Well, we can talk generally about silly mistakes for both tests. I'll give some general tips and ideas, and then, you can check out the video that comes out on Tuesday. So, how to avoid or improve on silly mistakes. So, first, to define a silly mistake. I think the first thing to think about when you're thinking about so-called silly mistakes, where a lot of students get into trouble when they're reviewing their work, is they say, oh, I got this question wrong, but oh, that was a silly mistake. I probably wouldn't have done that on the real test. Or, oh, that's just a little error. I understand. I'll fix it next time. You want to be very careful not to dismiss mistakes that you might make as simply just silly, and therefore ones that presumably you wouldn't make next time, that it was just kind of a fluke one-off. Because a lot of times they actually might reveal some sort of hidden weakness or something that maybe you're not aware that you are unaware of, right? They may reveal something deeper about the way you're approaching questions or topics that requires further study. So I would say, first determine if your mistakes are actually silly mistakes. Some of them may not be. They may reveal something more profound that you have to pay more attention to. That said, what about the truly silly mistakes involving math or reading where, you do misread something or you're just rushing, whatever it may be? There's a lot of aspects to improve on this. One is time management. A lot of silly mistakes come out of rushing, and rushing comes out of not being able to finish the section in time, which may come out of inefficiencies, lack of preparation. So everything that we talk about in terms of time management will help you to slow down, use your time more efficiently, and therefore make less mistakes based on rushing. It will also allow you to check your answers, and especially for any questions that you've circled. So any questions that you've circled, as you're working through the test, you can go back if you have the time and review them. A third thing to do is check your work as you do it. So this is something that's pretty useful in math. As you're working through the problem, don't just do it absent-mindedly. Don't just do it mindlessly. Do it with attention to each step that you're doing. This is somewhat intensive, both energy and time-wise, but if you're aware of what you're doing, you can pick up on little mistakes as you are as you're doing it. This next tip is pretty useful for writing and reading. Reread the question and the choices. A lot of times mistakes come from reading the question too quickly, overlooking something that's significant, reading the choices too quickly, overlooking a word that might change your interpretation of that choice, whether it's right or wrong. the choices, the question and the choices are absolutely critical to doing well on reading and writing. So make sure if you're stuck, if you're having problems, reread the question. Maybe you missed something. Reread the choices. Maybe you missed something. I would also say, like I just said before, on Tuesday, I'm going to have a more specific video about this topic for math. So I would add that in as well. So these are some general ideas. I'm probably going to make a whole video about avoiding silly mistakes and the theory behind it at another time, involving kind of the difference between intuition on the one hand and mindfulness on the other when you're approaching questions, the pros and cons of each. But I'll leave it at that because this is probably all we want to get into for now. Can colleges find out your score on a certain subject test even if you didn't send them? So every college has its own policies. Some colleges require you to send every score from the test that you've taken. Other colleges don't care. You can send them whatever you want. So this question really concerns, in particular, the colleges that want to see every single score. And so here's the thing. Legally, the College Board cannot release your scores to anyone without your permission. And they also can't tell the colleges what tests you've taken in addition to the scores you got on those tests without your permission. So if you're applying to a school that requires all tests, they can't go to the College Board and say, please give us all of this student's scores, because you have to send them out. That at least makes it seem like the College Board would not be able to find out if you had a certain score on a subject test or an SAT that you weren't giving them, that they wanted to see. However, my philosophy on this is send them everything for two reasons. Number one, a low score is not going to really hurt you as much as you might fear it could. Even if you took let's say you took a chemistry subject test and you bombed it, whatever, that happens. It's not going to be that big of a deal. If they see it, they see it. It's not going to be the make or break issue, because there's a lot of reasons why you could have gotten that low score. Second, if somehow they did find out that there was a score you didn't send them, and one way sometimes this happens is on college transcripts, for example, or high school transcripts. If they found out you didn't send them a score they wanted, you can get into trouble. Who knows? Maybe they would rescind the admission. So it's not really worth the risk, in my opinion, of so little downside of giving them a score versus so big of a downside of them finding out that you didn't give them the score. So I would say send whatever college policy is, follow their policies. If they want to see every score, send them everything. If they don't, send them your best. It's as simple as that. I wouldn't overcomplicate it any further. We have a two-part question. So first things first, this is a dual passage. We don't really even care about passage 2 right now. We're answering questions about passage 1. So we're fine. Let's just do passage 1. Number 2, it's a history passage, so the language is a little bit tricky, and I'm sure we will get into an analysis of what's going on in this passage, how we figure out what it's trying to say. And then we have a two-part question. We've got a question in 33, which is asking about something in the passage, and then 34, we need to find the lines that support that choice. So let's begin. The first thing I do with these evidence questions is I see the range of lines that we could find the answer in. So it's from 9 to 37. And what I do first is I bracket the passage from 9 to 37. And so if you can see between these two red brackets, I know my answer has got to be between these brackets somewhere. So the answer to 33 is somewhere in here. Then what I start doing is I read the question. So Lincoln contends that breaking the law has which consequence? And I try to see if there are any what I call keywords in the question. So here I think consequence is a keyword. It's just something I want to look for as I read. What are consequences of breaking the law? So as I read in between these bracketed lines, I want to pay attention and try to see, okay, are there any consequences to breaking the law that Lincoln lays out? So then I would start reading. So let's begin with line 9. Let every man remember that to violate the law is to trample on the blood of his father and to tear the character of his own and his children's liberty. So let's stop right there. Immediately, I think I find something that I like. To violate the law, in other words, break the law, is to trample on the blood of his father and to tear the character of his own and his children's liberty. So clearly we can see breaking the law has a very bad consequence, which is to trample on the blood of his father, which means kind of like to dishonor his memory, essentially, right? Think about when this is written. This is written in the 1800s. There are probably people that, the people's fathers probably fought in the Revolutionary War, or at least were somewhat involved in early American history. Point is, to break the law would be to trample on that legacy, that blood of the father, and to tear the character of his own and his children's liberty. So again, to kind of sully the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the values and freedoms that have you and your children have inherited from the past, essentially. So I can stop right there and I can look at the choices and I can see if any of these seem to match. And what I would find right away, B, it undermines and repudiates the nation's values. This is essentially a summary of what this is saying. Values referring to kind of the blood of the father, and the liberty, the character of our liberty being kind of the values. So that looks pretty good. So I might be pretty confident with B as a possible answer to this one. What I would do, though, is I would continue reading just to make sure. So I would read through the rest of this all the way through, and I would see if I find any evidence for A, C, or for D. And what I would find in this case is that I don't see any evidence for A, C, or D in the passage. I don't see anything that points to slowing the repeal of bad laws. I don't see anything about leading slowly but inexorably to rule by the mob. And I don't see anything about divisions between social groups. And you know what? Let's just read this and I'll kind of analyze this as we go, and you'll see that none of these choices match. So let's pick up where we left off. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. Let it be written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. So Pierre basically saying we should all revere laws at every level in every part of society. Everything from a child being raised, to education, to law, to legislative areas, wherever. And in short, let it become the political religion of the nation, and let the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the grave and the gay, of all sexes and tongues, and colors and conditions, sacrifice unceasingly upon its altars. Again, we should revere the law. Notice, importantly, thinking back to our question, none of this has anything to do with the consequence of breaking the law. Don't read too far into this to say, oh, okay, I don't know, maybe I can interpret this to mean A, C, or D. Don't go that far. Does it say anything about consequences? No. So this doesn't help. Let's read this part. When I so pressingly urge a strict observance of all the laws, let me not be understood as saying there are no bad laws, nor that grievances may not arise for the redress of which no legal provisions have been made. I mean to say no such thing. So he's not saying that there's no such thing as a bad law. But I do mean to say that although bad laws, if they exist, should be repealed as soon as possible, still while they continue in force, for the sake of example, they should be religiously observed. So also in unprovided cases. If such arise, let proper legal provisions be made for them without the least possible delay. But till then, let them, if not too intolerable, be borne with. There is no grievance that is the fit object of redress by mob law. So notice, again, there's nothing here, importantly, about consequences of breaking law. We only see that here. Right? Violating the law leads to this. And so we're going to put B for 33. And here's the key with the follow-up. We know exactly the answer to the next one. It's A. These are the lines 9 to 12 that we use to answer 33. And so we're done. So the key with these two-part questions is do the part 1 first, and then it basically makes the part 2 easy. I don't recommend, for reasons I go into elsewhere, like in the reading course, I don't recommend starting here and working backwards. I don't recommend that for various reasons. It's okay as a backup method, but not good as a primary method. Let me just check. All right. So that's just a quick run through of the kinds of things we would do for a reading question like this. I can't go through a complete reading passage. Maybe one day I was thinking what I might do in a future live stream is kind of give out something that we're going to work through together before the live stream, and that we can then work through it. There'll be like a little bit of lecture at the beginning of the live stream, and then I'll answer questions at the end. Let me know what you think about that, if that seems like a good idea, if that seems useful, so that we can do a bit more lecture rather than just Q&A, because it's hard to, we can spend more time talking about this, but that's a long time if people aren't prepared and ready to know that, okay, we're going to talk about reading today. So we'll leave it at that, but we'll go from there. Hi, your readers are so helpful. Thank you. Will you continue to cover the writing section in the test during this video? I'm in the 1350 range and have trouble in transition words in the writing section. So if you have a specific question that you wanted to go over from a previous test, we can take a look at it. In previous live streams, I think I talked about transition words and such. But let me just go through that briefly now. So these are those questions. We're not going to actually do this. I just want to show you an example so people know what kind of question we're talking. This also applies to the ACT. They have similar kinds of questions. So we're talking about questions like these, where it's like, which one of these words starts the sentence properly? And the way you want to think about these is in terms of categories. And there's probably quite a few categories, but there's three major ones that I want to talk about. Cause and effect, or conclusion. Contrast, and continuation. So these are three categories of words. In each of these categories, we can get all different kinds of words like these. So for example, cause and effect, you could have words like therefore, then. No, that would be more continuation. Therefore, thus, in conclusion, as a result. All of these show either this thing that's happening is an effect of some previous causes, or it's a conclusion that you draw based on previous statements, premises, things like that. So in this case, I don't think we have any. Yeah, we don't. This one in the original was for example. But you would use these if you think the sentence you're looking at is an effect of a previous sentence, or a concluding word of some kind, can conclude something. Contrast, these include words like however, nevertheless, despite, although, on the other hand. So these words show contrast. They show a shift in the direction of the movement of the paragraph from one sort of argument or examples or statements to a different kind, often an opposite kind. So when you see that shift in the passage of contrast, one thing to a different thing, you're going to want to use one of these words. Continuation includes words like in addition, then, subsequently, for example, for instance. All of these words show, similarly would be another one. Similarly. They all show you're building on a previous idea. So you're not concluding, you're not showing a cause and effect, you're not showing contrast, but you're building on some previous ideas presented earlier in the paragraph. So one other tip I can give about these kinds of questions is if you find two or more choices from the same category in your question, probably means it's not going to be the right answer. Or at least it'd be something you want to be skeptical of. So for example, since I have, for example, similarly and subsequently in the same question, there's a good chance that all three of those are wrong. Now, I don't know if that actually, let's see if that turned out to be the case here. No. So there was, one of these was the answer. I mean, they're pretty different even though they're from the same category, but you just want to be careful that if you have, let's say you had in a question, you had however and nevertheless, they're not exactly the same in meaning, but they're pretty darn close. So it's hard to know how one could be right and the other could be wrong. So what you'd want to do is just be very careful before you picked however. You better have a good reason why nevertheless wouldn't work, or vice versa. Most likely they would both be wrong. It just depends on the question. So just keep that in mind. Think in terms of these categories. You have to read the entire paragraph. You can't just read the sentence that it's in. You got to get the whole context. And yeah, I've got a lot more about this in my writing course. So for the SAT, I've got a free SAT writing course. And for the ACT, I've got the free ACT English Bootcamp. I cover all of this stuff in a lot more detail. So I recommend checking that out. So here's a passage. Some strategies, some approaches recommend that you read the passage through, and as you read, you do what's called annotation. And maybe some SAT strategies recommend this as well. So basically, you would read the first paragraph and then jot down a summary of what it's about. And then you read the next paragraph and jot down a summary, and then summary. And then, you read this and you summarize it. And you read this and you summarize it. And you summarize this and you summarize this. And then once you've done all that, you go to the questions and you start to answer them. Generally speaking, I do not recommend this strategy for two reasons. Number one, it's really time consuming. You have 8 minutes and 45 seconds per passage on the ACT, and you've got 13 minutes per passage on the SAT. Not a ton of time, so you can't spend half or more of that reading. You got to get to questions as soon as you can. Number two, a lot of the stuff you're going to be summarizing, kind of related to number one, a lot of the stuff you'll be paraphrasing or summarizing in the margins, maybe stuff that they ask no questions about. So why do we care, right? If none of, like, for example, let's say this paragraph here. Let's say there are no questions that require us to have even read that paragraph. Spending time paraphrasing or summarizing it then is a huge waste of time. And we won't know which paragraphs are going to be important until we get right to the questions. So that's why we want to, for the ACT and the SAT, there's a little bit of a difference between the two based on, you do on the ACT want to do a quick read of it. On the SAT, I don't recommend reading the passage ahead. I recommend going right to the questions. But you do want to make sure you get right to the questions as soon as possible, because that will tell you what's important and what's not. That will tell you what you should focus and what you should spend your time on. So no, I don't recommend reading the practice tests, reading the passages and annotating detailed, because it just takes way too long. Question about SAT subject tests. Are Barron's and Princeton Review both needed for SAT Bio? So generally, I don't know much about Bio, but I'm sure it's probably similar to, let's say, Math 2 or Chemistry or any other test that these companies make. If you can swing it, if you could get Barron's and Princeton Review, I think it's a good idea, because generally speaking, Barron's material is harder than the real test, whereas Princeton Review is slightly easier. And you might think, why would I want something easier when I can get something harder? The problem is it's not actually necessarily a great thing for your material to be always too hard, because then you might focus on things that aren't really relevant or aren't even tested. Sometimes Barron's goes a little overboard, but it is more challenging with certain questions. So that's good to get that top end difficulty. But then with something like Princeton Review, the questions are easier, but they're a little bit more realistic on average. So you make sure with the Princeton Review, you're going to hit kind of the core concepts that are going to be on the test. And then with something like a Barron's, you're going to have questions that are going to help you with kind of top end difficulty. So if you can get both and use them in conjunction, that's probably the best. That's what I do for chemistry. It's what I do for Math 2. And I'm sure it's the same for bio. If you can only afford one, then I would go with Barron's. Because then you're going to get something relatively comprehensive, and it's going to, top end difficulty is better than just being a little bit too easy. So if you can only afford one, go with Barron's. But if you can get both, I would recommend using both Barron's and Princeton Review. Yeah, so there's a follow-up. I've heard that concepts are missing in Princeton Review. Yes. I think the core ones are there. There's going to be some edge case material that's not there. So this is true. But you kind of have the opposite problem in like a Barron's. In Barron's, you have concepts in the book that aren't on the test. And in many ways, that's just as bad, because you're spending time, energy, stress, worrying about stuff that's not on the test. That's kind of bad as well. So that's why I think you use both. You get that middle ground. With the Princeton, you're going to get the core topics. You're going to get the core stuff that's definitely on the test, maybe slightly easier, but put it this way. If you can't do the Princeton Review stuff, then the Barron's isn't going to save you. You need to master the Princeton Review stuff at a minimum, and then you worry about the top end difficulty with Barron's. That's what I would say. Try to split the difference between them. That would be my recommendation. Okay, this next question applies to, I really messed this up, applies to SAT and ACT equally. This is specifically about the ACT, but it's really about any test you want to get a perfect score on. Does getting a 36 require luck, or is the test that predictable that you can pull off a top end score every time? So, even the best test takers, even tutors, won't get a 36 every time because we're human and we make mistakes, number one. So there is a certain element of luck involved on SAT and ACT, in the sense of, do you have a good day or a bad day? Did you overlook something that, 99 times out of 100 you wouldn't, but it was just that bad luck of that one time where you missed it and you get it wrong? On the ACT, for example, especially in the math, in the 51 to 60, they've got a lot of really hard questions that sometimes, like vectors and matrices that maybe you're just not familiar with. So maybe one test, you've got a question on matrices that you just don't know, whereas in another test you don't. So there's a little luck there. So luck is absolutely part of this. That said, I think, most tutors or a lot of tutors will get 36 relatively often, where it's not just luck, that there is some skill involved. There's a lot of skill involved, but that it's not just pure luck. It's not totally random whether you get a 36 or not, right? So some tutors or some people who are just good at the test, maybe they can get a 36 75% of the time, 60% of the time, whatever it is. I don't know exact numbers. So there is skill involved. And what you want to think about is when you're thinking about your score on the SAT or the ACT, think about it as a range. So if you, let's say on your ACT, you scored a 28. Really, if you think about it, on any given day, you're probably capable of anything from a 26 to about a 30 as kind of a range of possible scores, depending on luck, depending on how you feel that day, other factors in and out of your control. Really, your score is a range. And that's actually why the SAT and the ACT often report your score as a range, because you should think about it like that. And that's where the variance comes in. So on some days, maybe you'll get a 30. Some days you'll get a 28. Some days you'll get a 26. It just depends. And so really what you're trying to do when you're prep is you're not just trying to, not like you're at a 28 and you're trying to get it to a 34 or something. What you're trying to do is shift the entire range of your scores up. So maybe you're now from a 32 to a 36 as your range. So on a given day, maybe you get lucky, you get a 36. Other days, you get a little bit rougher, you have a 32. So think of your score as a range. And what you can do to help improve your chances of getting a 36 is build on your habits and your knowledge to push that range to the top. So for example, if I had to give myself a range, I would say my range is like 34 to 36, much more heavily weighted to the top end to the bottom end. So if I'm really, really lazy and not thinking, I could get 34 if I'm just doing it, trying to swear, doing it half-butted, doing it not really all the way. If I'm really trying really, really hard and I'm concentrating, then a 36, really good chance of that, right? And so why is that? Well, I've studied this test a lot. I know what's on the test. I know all the formulas. I know all the concepts. I'm a pretty good reader. I'm good at science. I know strategies. I know my own weaknesses and things I need to pay attention to. So it's from experience. And so that's what, I can't guarantee myself, for example, a 36 every time. We're all human beings. Everyone makes mistakes. But I can certainly guarantee that I'm going to have a really good chance of it at every time. So think of it as chance. Think of it as building skills and habits that can push that score range up. And this also applies to the SAT. And so there's always natural variance. You want to look at how your score as an average is changing over time. What's the best method for practicing for Math 2? YouTube, Khan Academy, reviewing pre-calc and trig, or taking practice exams, taking it this weekend. So if you're taking it this weekend, I would do practice exams because you don't have much time. Do it timed. Try to make them real tests if you can find them, or if you can get books with real tests. There's one official College Board test book with 2 practice Math 2 tests. I don't know if you've used that yet, but that exists. So since you're short term, you're taking it this weekend, just do practice tests at this point. If there's any particular topics that you can see that are giving you trouble consistently, then check out Khan Academy for particular topics, like if you don't know logs or whatever. I have a Math 2 course, which you might want to check out. Go to my website, look up members.reasonprep.com, what I was saying before. I've got a course on Math 2. It's a kind of a review course, so that might help. But I would say otherwise, though, do practice tests. That's the most important thing.